In this video, we're going to talk about converting a tri-mesh to a quad mesh in Blender, taking files from Fusion 360 into Blender and back again. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video I'm going to carry on with the current theme of talking about the transition between 3D CAD and poly modeling. Now, we've already covered the workflow in both directions. We know how to take something from Fusion to Blender, we know how to bring something from Blender back to Fusion, and some of the ways we can work with that mesh. But a question came up about converting tris to quads, so I wanted to talk about that in case there is a reason that you would go from Fusion to Blender and then back to Fusion again. This should be true with most poly modeling programs and most CAD programs in general. So let's take a look at the process. First, I just modeled a very simple bracket, something that had some square corners, some rounds, and some holes through it. So that way we would have sort of a good situation that you would typically come across when you're trying to convert some sort of parametric design. So when we export that as an FBX and I bring it into Blender, this is what it looks like. So it's the same part, everything looks the same. However, when we take a look at the mesh, you can see that we've got a lot of triangles, and this is how CAD files are typically converted. They don't really care about maintaining quads. You can kind of see inside we've got this sort of triangular mesh. There's a line in the middle, and then things just kind of get generally crazy. Now, when we're looking at a design like this and we want to figure out how we can turn this into a quad mesh, we typically do this with modifiers. So when we have the body selected, we can add a modifier to remesh the entire design. And when we do this, there are a couple things that we should talk about. The first of which is I'm going to change my display to show viewport shading, and this right now will show us the underlying mesh, so that way we can get a good idea of what we're getting out of this. Then there are a couple different ways that we can use this remesh to our advantage. When we look at blocks, the blocks are going to be creating a very basic form, creating these blocks. And in this case, it's not going to be a good solution. There probably is a case that you could come up with that this would work, but in most situations, this is probably not going to be the option. Next is smooth. Now, smooth is a very interesting one because it allows us to take a design which was very prismatic and create a sort of a softened version. This is not going to be great when we talk about things like the holes. You can instantly see that this is problematic for us. Now, the next one, sharp, is probably going to be our best bet. When we look at this, you can see that the corners are nice, the fillets don't really have the high resolution that we would expect, but the rest of it does look pretty good. The way that we get around the resolution in these holes is to talk about some of the options that we have. Now, in this case, the octree depth is going to be the resolution. So if we increase this, let's say if we go to 5, you can see that we've already got a much closer representation to the original. If we go to 6, then we're even closer. Now, there is a problem here. If we are talking about taking this back to Fusion 360 or CAD, if we want to turn this back into some sort of prismatic design, then we have to be careful with the number of quads that we get. Notice that we do also have a scale. We can increase or decrease that, and it does have some effect on the overall shape. You can see that it's growing and shrinking the size of each of those elements, and you'll notice that it separates around the edge and the corner. Now, we can go pretty drastic with this, but there is going to be a point where there is diminishing returns, right? So if we get this scale to be much smaller or much bigger, you can see that we're going to get to a situation where it might not make much sense. We also have the sharpness value. Now, the sharpness value you probably aren't going to see unless we sort of have a much lower resolution. I'm going to keep this value pretty high, so I want to leave that pretty high. But in general, you will notice a difference between some of these settings. Most likely the octree depth is going to be the one that you're going to want to play with. Once we have this sort of conversion of that tri, then we can use apply. And now what we've done is we've taken the design that we started with. If we hit tab to go into edit mode, you can see now we have something that is essentially true quads that allows us to come in and manipulate it. It's not perfect. You'll notice that there is some areas where it's not going to be perfect, but that's because it's trying to turn this into quads. And there are some cases, if we go and we look around this hole, you can see that there is a vertex that's sort of in between here, and that's in order to maintain that quad relationship. From here, if I take this back into Fusion 360, this is where it really starts to get tricky. So I'm going to export this, and I could do, again, STL, OBJ. Those are the two big ones when we're going back and forth. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this one try quad, and I'm going to go ahead and export that. Then let's hop back into Fusion. Let's bring it back in and just see what this looks like. In order to do this, as I mentioned before, we can go into Mesh and we can insert a mesh. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to select Try Quad, and now I've inserted this mesh. I'm going to move it, and notice that the scale of this thing is pretty small. And again, this is an issue that we run into because of the differences between the scale that we're working in Fusion and the scale that's default in Blender. Now, if you work in Blender often and you change the scale of what you're doing, then you can have a little bit more control over this. I don't think it's really beneficial at this stage for us to worry too much about it, but we can scale it up and down in here as well. But the thing that we really want to look at is the cleanliness of this mesh. And again, note that even though we have some areas that look like triangles, these are true quads because they are broken up in the middle. For you to create a mesh like this from this design is not very realistic. If I take this body, I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it so I've got that sort of extra copy there. And I try to convert that by tessellating it into a mesh. Let's go ahead and let's use create. We're going to select our BREP. We're going to try to create quads, and we preview this. Notice that even though it's trying to create quads, this basically looks like the FBX that we exported. Now, there are some cases where this works really well. In a lot of cases, you'll find that with holes, you'll still get a lot of these triangles. So again, it's not a very clean method to get that nice mesh. At this point, what could we do with this? Well, we could come into create form, and we could try to convert it. Now, I will say that this does work better on some things more than others. It's probably not going to work well here, but let's just try it and let's see what happens. It's cranking, it's cranking. In this case, it actually was able to spit out a T-spline body, which is pretty great. I was not expecting to be able to turn that mesh into a T-spline body. So this is a really good result. Obviously, if we hide the edges, you can see that everything is rounded, which means that we would need to come in, we would need to grab these edge loops, and we would need to crease them in order to actually get this to be creased like we would want. And that's going to take some time. But the benefit here is that we relatively quickly, we were able to take this design, turn it into a mesh in Blender, convert it to a quad, and bring it back into Fusion. Now, the big question that you're probably asking is, why would anybody do this workflow? What is the reason behind doing something like this? Well, it would have to be extremely specific. But a lot of times you want to take something into Blender for physics animations, for just rendering, just animations, maybe UV unwrapping to get decals. And that's a situation where it makes sense to take a design from Fusion to Blender. Now, in a case like this bracket, probably never going to happen. There's probably no good reason for us to model something like this and take it into Blender. If you're trying to make an extremely detailed scene and you need some of these sort of parametric prismatic type features, then yeah, maybe you could do that. But there's not really a good reason why you would want to bring that back into Fusion after you exported it. So honestly, I don't have a good sort of situational workflow that this would make sense. Again, that's not to say it doesn't exist, but at least now you have the information, the understanding of how you can make that work. So let's just do a quick recap because we've covered this in several different videos and a lot of different workflows, and I just want to make sure that we understand a few of the basics. When we're designing in Fusion 360, typically what we're doing is we're making prismatic parametric features. That's not universally true, but in general, when you think of CAD, you think of creating sketches, creating extrudes, adding features like fillets or shelling a design. And those are the types of things that CAD is really good at. Makes clean faces and clean surfaces, and it has these nice, sharp, crisp corners. And it doesn't care if we come back and we cut a cylindrical revolve out of the side of this thing because it knows how to calculate all of those elements. Now, Fusion's really good at that. Other CAD programs, Inventor, SolidWorks, Solid Edge, and so on, these are all good at this as well. But Blender is a poly modeling program. It's something that you would go into and you would create typically characters for animations, assets for video games, you would do rendering, you would do physics simulations, things like that. It's not typically a program where you would come in and actually model something like this mesh that we've converted. So things like this, what typically is called hard surface modeling, is trickier to do in Blender. And I shouldn't say trickier to do. It's a different workflow, but it's trickier to do accurately. You wouldn't design something like this to manufacture it in Blender. If you had to have this part machined or cast or molded, then you would do that in a program like Fusion 360. So there is a very different workflow, a very different approach. Where the waters get muddied a bit is when you have situations where you're making complex designs, you're making 3D surfaces, you're using the T-spline functionality, and maybe you need to take that out for some reason and work in Blender, and maybe you end up needing to bring it back for more detailed work. So that's really where this workflow makes sense, is to take a design that has a lot of those sort of hard features, things that are very clean, you make them with sketches, you create extrudes, and you have those nice hard surfaces that you can get out of a CAD making these BREP models. And then elements go into Blender for rendering or for whatever the reason, and then maybe you need to come back and add some more detail. Now, I do plan to talk a little bit about taking a car model from Blender and bringing it into Fusion and having something that we can edit. It's a little bit of a tricky topic because an entire car has too many quads for us to convert using forms. There is a limit. I don't remember exactly what the limit is, but if you try to take a design that has too many quads, then it will fail to convert. So there is that limit that we're up against, and there are some tricks that we need to think about in terms of the workflow to make that happen. I do plan to cover that at some point. I really don't think that very many people are doing that workflow, so I just haven't covered it yet. But at this point, we have everything we need to be able to go from Fusion to Blender and from Blender back to Fusion. Whatever you decide to do with that workflow, obviously, it just kind of depends on what you're modeling. But if there are any questions to any aspect of this, going from Fusion to Blender or Blender to Fusion or anything like that, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.